The Plastic Overshoot Day basically is the date after which we have, as humanity, used up all of the available waste management infrastructure and system. And it means that every other day after the Plastic Overshoot Day, the plastic that we consume will end up directly into the environment.
I guess in the past we had the recycler people with a mindset of circularity saying we can solve the problem with just more circularity. And we had, let's say, the no plastic people saying we just don't need to use no plastic for many reasons. I guess these two extreme mindsets are going to join together more and more, because more and more science is there to show that it's not only about waste management, it's also about toxicity.
Welcome to Plastisphere, the podcast on plastics, people, and the planet. My name is Anja Krieger. The Global Plastics Treaty is in the making, and the discussions around solutions to plastic pollution are gaining traction. To give you more food for thought, I'm trying out a new format, the Plastisphere Conversations. As you might know, many of my episodes are narrated stories, with many different voices and lots of music and sound. I truly love making them, and I won't stop, but they can take forever, weeks to months. So in between, I'd like to share with you the conversations I'm having with interesting people in the field. And this is the first one. I met up with Sarah Perreard and Julien Boucher from the Plastic Overshoot project. Isn't it called the Earth Overshoot, you might wonder? Well, yes, Sarah and Julien took inspiration from that. In 2023, they first calculated the Plastic Overshoot Day, which falls on July 28th. And the calculations behind this day reveal the different challenges for countries around the world. But first, Sarah and Julien told me their own stories, which are very telling when it comes to the issue and its solutions. Here's Sarah.
I started actually working within the plastic industry 15 years ago. In a large industrial plastic manufacturer. And this is actually where I learned about the consequence of plastic after quite a few years that I was working there. So with, really this narrative of plastic helps develop the world, plastics allow us to decarbonize the world, etc. And then I just discovered about the Great Pacific Patch and oceans filled with plastic and so on, which at the time when I started were really not visible at all. And so I was quite full of outrage, I think, having been part of that without really knowing it. And I was vocal about it internally. So I was given a chance to actually be part of the solution from the inside. And I was said, okay, so if we're doing really like bad things, come help figure things out instead of criticizing it. And that's how I started working on trying to make plastic more circular, working in different countries, collection and recycling initiatives, etc. With, of course, really like a range of the vision that was very focused or not having the big picture at the time. And also having worked on projects in the field, in developing countries which were lacking infrastructure, etc. When I look back, realizing the corporate influence over projects that really felt that were right, but then now when I look back, I'm actually pretty skeptical about some of those projects that I actually was running, and I was feeling like I was part of the solution, etc. And I realized that things were actually not sustainable. It was, I would call it today greenwashing for many of the things. So it allowed me to really shift towards working more on system change and what were the needed mechanisms actually to reduce the plastic pollution crisis. So I started working on extended producer responsibility with governments. And then really that's where the focus of better science came in, and actually where Julien and I started working together, because I needed data to understand what were the right interventions that the industry should focus on. And obviously, once you start looking through the lenses of science, there are a lot of other things that you hadn't necessarily seen or heard before, because you were looking at things with a very narrow view of it, that appears more and more bigger and bigger, let's say. That's when I started really feeling a disconnect between what I was trying to do and the agenda that I had to have in order to be able to pursue that from the industry side. So I decided to leave the corporate world about 4 years ago. But I didn't want to work completely outside of it, because I also value a lot what I learned from working within the industry. I think in order to change a system, you really need to understand it. But it was also getting harder and harder to actually change it from the inside when my agenda and my understanding of what was needed to actually change the system was more and more obviously incompatible with the industry growth agenda for plastic. And so I left the industry, continued to work with the industry and with NGOs and others from the outside as a consultant. This is when one of my projects actually led me to try to put together a global database on plastic flows in the world. And that's when we started collaborating with Julien. We were from different sides at the time. We had a very large project approved, supported by industry, actually. And then along the lines, I think what we were trying to do became a little too transparent and as a result risky for some industry players. And the project was rescoped into something that we felt was meaningless. So I left this project again. And then a few months after, we decided together with Julien to actually launch it by ourselves without funding or a little bit of funding and a lot of hard work from our teams. Now we really try to have this balanced approach of, on one hand, creating the science and using it for action in order to actually raise the bar for corporations who have a very progressive narrative, let's say, and we try to hold them accountable for following up on this progressive narrative.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's such an interesting story. Julien, where did you come from before you met Sarah? And how did that first project develop once you started collaborating?
Yeah, so I guess my life pathway is a bit the opposite of Sarah's. I am a scientist as a background, and then I more and more came to work closer to the industry. I guess I didn't want to stay in the academic. I wanted faster moving projects. I wanted more direct impact. So I quickly became a consultant, let's say.
Where in the sciences did you work, or what was your discipline or field or expertise?
Environmental science in general, and as a specialty, water treatment. So developing processes to clean polluted water. At that time, we are based in Switzerland, so I was working during my PhD on treating contaminated water from Swiss chemical industry. And then during my PhD, the industry came on and said to my supervisor, okay, quite interesting what you are doing, but we have moved our production in somewhere in Southeast Asia, so we don't need the process for cleaning the water anymore. So I finished my PhD, but I was very pissed off, and I decided I want to stop working on end-of-pipe type of solutions, but I want to work more upstream, to develop more systemic solutions. And this is how I started working on LCA, so life cycle assessment, trying to eco-design products and services and systems so we avoid the problems at the first place and we are not trying to solve the problems afterwards. So this is basically where I come from, so quite technical background, but then started to try to take a more systemic view of things and to, let's say, anticipate the problem. And to do so, what you basically need is tools, I would say, or we can say metrics, to better understand the system you are studying. So this is how I went into LCA, life cycle assessment, which is basically footprinting and developing metrics and methodologies and frameworks to assess the environmental impacts of products, right? So I became what we call a research consultant or activist consultant, and we are really trying to put ourselves in between science, consulting, and activism to try to find this sweet spot where we can have the most impact in a way by being fast, being science-driven, and having some sort of passion or mission that is really embedded in what we are doing. So we are really trying to create an impact. And because water is important for me, as on a personal note, I always try to work on water-related topics. And 10 years ago, I guess almost now, the plastic topic became something, right? It was not only about chemical pollution, it was also about plastics and microplastics. So coming from the LCA, life cycle assessment world, I saw, well, this is not accounted for in the tools we are currently using to inform the private sector on how to do better products, right? So we need new ways to account for plastic pollution. And this is basically how I started working on developing the plastic footprint concept and the plastic footprint methodology and the data that you need to run this type of models. And this is joining what Sarah just mentioned. You need a lot of data to do this type of assessment. There are lots of data out there, but it's some sort of data mess. So our work has also been to try to clean the mess, to create some more robust and comprehensive data sets that we can now use to really better understand the systems we are working with and try to derive better solutions for the packaging or for the textile industry, for example.
Yeah, I mean, life cycle analysis is also often cited to say that plastics are relatively impact-free compared to other materials. So, but what you're saying is that the life cycle analysis did not account for the pollution, the plastic pollution, the microplastic pollution?
Yeah, that's the point. I mean, if you look at classical LCA, mainly focusing on energy and carbon footprint, in many cases, you will see that plastic is quite a good option because it's lightweight. So when you transport it, when you have less food waste, etc., etc. So unfortunately, and I did quite a lot of projects of this type, you do an eco-design for a packaging for a company, you end up saying plastic is the best option. This is what we did in the past. And I realized there is something wrong with that. But the reason why there is something wrong is we are missing a measurement, an assessment of plastic pollution, right? It was not part of the game in a way. From an accounting perspective, no plastic was leaking into the environment in these analyses, while in reality, it's happening everywhere. So this is basically what you need to factor in back. So you can then take a decision with having both plastic pollution and carbon footprint on other metrics, toxicity and all this stuff in mind when you take some design decisions. That's for sure. And then maybe something to mention too is that if you take a broader picture, so you're not just looking at the packaging for a given purpose, where if you do so from a carbon footprint perspective, plastic may be a good option. But if you take a broader view of things and you look at the full, let's say, food system, if you are thinking about a food product with a pack, you realize that in a way, plastic is just one part of the problem. The problem is we have a very global food or supply chain system with a lot of transportation, with a lot of impacts everywhere, where plastic may be quite a good solution. If you keep this, you cannot just remove plastic and keep all the rest the same. You will create many other problems by just using another material. So to remove plastic, you must not only change the material, but you must change in a way, the logistic and the value chain that is behind the product. And this is why LCA may be misleading if you just look at the pack. That was just a side note, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, very interesting.
Just to say that also in a different way, what it means is that plastic actually enables the type of economy that we have today, that is cheap, that is globalized, with complicated supply chains and value chains. And somehow the bigger picture issue that we have is a problem of overconsumption, which fuels the climate crisis. And a lot of that, even though on an individual item, if you compare a life cycle assessment of a product packaged in plastic or a product packaged in something else or made of plastic or made of something else, plastic is winning from an LCA perspective often. It also actually enables this huge consumption that might otherwise not be happening. And so this is where somehow this is also the limits of looking sometimes at very precise metrics without integrating the broader system that is created as a result, and that leads to actually more consumption that you had before. So, and that is just not integrated in life cycle assessments, in the way that we can look at it. So it's good to just kind of take a step back and remember that plastic enables this overconsumption.
Right. And I mean, we're exceeding the planetary boundaries pretty much almost on all levels, right? So we have multiple crises. People often talk about the triple planetary crisis, right? Climate change, biodiversity loss, and the pollution. But there's also so many other things like land use, like fertilizer input, and so forth. So that brings us to the system that is basically producing the unsustainable situation that we have to get out of to go into a better future. And I think one concept that was brought in to make that clear how much we are overusing the planet is the Earth Overshoot Day, right?
Yeah, absolutely. This has been a huge inspiration for us because obviously on a daily basis, we develop the pretty geeky science, the stuff that we are used to discussing with scientists or with people in the environmental field. But we really have this sort of mission internally of also breaking down the ivory tower of science and making it available for citizens, for NGOs, for governments, etc., basically for all stakeholders that have a role to play. And we strongly believe that every stakeholder has a role to play, from citizen to industry, etc. But we also realize that a lot of what we develop and those plastic waste management data, etc., that we develop is also not so easy to comprehend. And so we were trying to find ways where we can convey that message in a digestible way. And obviously the Earth Overshoot Day has made this brilliant idea of using the number of days in the year and to give a date. Everyone actually can realize, like, what does it mean when something happens in March versus in December, right? And so this is a scale that we are all used to using on a daily basis. So we felt that to give a better vision of what is the extent of plastic pollution, this was really a way that everyone could understand. The Plastic Overshoot Day basically is the date after which we have, as humanity, used up all of the available waste management infrastructure and system. And it means that every other day after the Plastic Overshoot Day, the plastic that we consume will end up directly into the environment. And every country has a different date too, because every country has very different waste management capabilities. But what we felt was an even more powerful way of grasping this country level information is how much of the 157 days of plastic overshoot that this year we will have is each country contributing? Because it's really key to realize that some countries may have a plastic overshoot day that is really early, let's say in January. So they almost basically have no proper waste management infrastructure in place. So you might think, okay, this country is really a huge polluter, right? But actually, if the country uses very small volumes of plastic, like many developing countries do, they might actually only participate to a few seconds or minutes to the overall 157 days of plastic overshoots. And on the other hand, some countries, which dates are later on in the year because they have pretty well developed waste management infrastructure. So we could take the example of the US, for example. They will have their plastic overshoot day on the 30th of November. So about, let's say, 1 month of plastic overshoot, which is on paper much better than a country that has its overshoot in January, right? But actually, the US consumes so much plastic per capita, and it's also a large country, that they do contribute to quite a lot on the big picture. 4.6 days of plastic overshoot for one country, and out of 157 days, that is quite a lot. And so all of those detailed data are really things that we feel consumers and citizens of the countries, but also companies operating in those countries, governments themselves, and the country delegates for the plastic treaty should know, because that influences a lot what they should be doing about it. And so this was really a huge inspiration from the Earth Overshoot Day, and then trying to really empower everyone with those information that would be easier to understand than what we usually develop in terms of pretty geeky data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you boil that down to the Global Plastic Overshoot Day, which you calculated for 2023 is July 28th. But Julien, the story is much more complicated than that, right? And that's also what you want to convey.
Yeah, I guess maybe to make it very clear what we are trying to do in Plastic Overshoot Day, we have the term day, but we also have the term overshoot. And it's really important to understand that one of the key issues with plastic pollution is this mismatch between the capacity we have in countries, in communities to properly collect and dispose from the waste, and how much waste we actually put on the market, I would say, or put in the waste bin. And there is a clear mismatch. About 40%, something like that, of the waste globally is mismanaged, which corresponds to these 157 days. In a way, we are deliberately putting more waste on the market than we know the system is capable to cope with, right? So what does it mean? Everything that is not collected, and in many countries, a huge fraction of the waste is just not collected because there is not enough funding, there is not enough people, there are not enough trucks or waste bins. So the waste is just discarded on the street, everywhere, and it's not collected. And if it's collected in some countries, then it's going to be improperly disposed of. So meaning it's going to end up in a dump site, it's going to end up in a landfill that is not sanitary. And all these practices or mismanagement practices, let's say, are leading to leakage, because when it's raining, when it's windy, the waste is going to go away and end up either in the soil, in the forest, or in the ocean or in the river, right? So that's the overshoot. So we are living with an overshoot, and basically the message we are trying to give is to say, we must close this gap, right? We must reduce this overshoot either by reducing the amount of waste we put on the market and or by increasing the capacity of the system to cope with all this waste. So it's not so much complicated, right? It's just we need to acknowledge that there is a mismatch. And as a company, in a way, as a country, you should be aware that either you have to increase your capacity or you have to find a way to reduce the input in the system, and because this is the way to close the gap, right?
Mm-hmm. What I hear in Germany a lot is, practically no plastics end up in the environment from us. We have this great recycling system. We treat our waste properly. You classified the countries by type. And so where does Germany stand there?
So maybe just before Sarah can elaborate on the archetypes, there are several ways plastic can escape into the environment from a country like even Germany or Switzerland. One way is through littering, because littering in the street still exists everywhere. And this is like more behavioral stuff, but it exists everywhere and it contributes to the leakage. The second aspect or pathway how waste can escape from these type of countries is through export, because we export a lot of waste meant to be recycled in other countries, but sometimes it's just export without recycling. So these wastes are piling up somewhere, maybe mismanaged, and cause some leakage. And the third aspect to keep in mind is plastic pollution is not only from macroplastic, from packaging waste or waste, it's also from microplastic, resulting from the shedding of textile microfibers, from the abrasion of tires while driving, from paint abrasion, and many other sources. And this also contributes to the overshoot, and most especially in the developed countries with more intense economic activity.
Right, right. And how can you manage something that ends up in the air, like the dust from car tires, or even from bike tires, or from sneakers, or from the paints on all the buildings that we have? I mean, that's a really hard source to tackle, right?
Yeah, for these more diffuse sources, I guess it's almost impossible to tackle this in a end-of-life way. It really needs to be done by design, by better design of the tires, of the textile, of the paint. So we try to avoid the shedding of fibers or reduce the abrasion at the source.
Mm-hmm. So basically we produce differently, we design better products, and we don't wait until there is pollution or the products have become waste to then clean them up.
Yeah, I guess this is a very complex, more complex issue. And when we model trajectories for the future, in a way, we can draw solutions for the packaging, for the macroplastics, where we end up close to zero leakage. But for the microplastic, it's a bit more tricky because we don't necessarily have the solutions or the design ideas in place. But let's focus on most of the issue, which still in terms of magnitude or mass stem from the macroplastic and the mismanaged short lifetime plastics. The macroplastic, which by definition are larger objects, typically a packaging or a textile, a piece of garment, anything which is bigger than 5 millimeter, that in turn may degrade once in the environment and become secondary microplastic, mainly coming from mismanaged waste.
So we have these very different, some hard to tackle sources, and I would think that every country has their own profile as to how much of each source is entering the environment, right?
Yeah, exactly. Countries have, for plastic, a lot of different phases, let's say. Some countries have huge waste generation and some others really tiny ones. Some countries have less than a few kilos of plastic consumption every year, while some others have more than 100 kilo per person every year. And then in terms of also how countries are managing their waste. Some export a lot of waste. Some also import a lot of waste. Some do both. So that's already a very different picture in terms of how their waste system works. And then, of course, the waste mismanagement level. And so when we're trying to break that down into something easy for the countries to understand, we came up with this idea of developing country archetypes that are based on those characteristics. And so we have some, for example, that are huge import and export countries. So it means they're really doing trade of waste. And we call them the transactors. They're typically Western countries or rich countries who have typically a high consumption of plastic. They do a lot of trading of waste because there are some that they have developed an industry for recycling and others that they don't touch at all. So they export it. So that's one typical archetype that we see a lot in Europe. Germany, for example, is part of this type of countries. Then we have some countries which are self-sustaining themselves, meaning they pretty much treat their own waste internally. Others who are consuming lots of plastic, but they really struggle with managing it. Like Qatar is one, for example. So we call them the strugglers. There are some who are huge consumers of plastic who are exporting a lot of this plastic outside. So it means that they basically fill up the waste management systems of other countries. We call those the overloaders. One example are the United States of America, for example. And then we have those that we call the toxic exporters. The toxic exporters are also huge consumers of plastics. They export it, but in places which don't necessarily have the infrastructure, because the place where the countries are exporting their waste obviously has a huge impact over the overall plastic pollution that they create. So we made the separation between those who are exporting in countries where it can be well managed versus those who are exporting in places which are just accepting the waste because they do get paid for that, but actually it results into plastic pollution. And then there are the waste saviors, those countries who are treating their waste pretty well, and they're also accepting other waste that they treat well. So as a result, they really are part of the solution, if you wish to see it like that. There are those who we call the waste sponges. And the waste sponges are really typically those global south countries who are receiving a lot of the waste, usually from the toxic exporters or overloaders. And they're absorbing this waste, but it also is creating huge issues of plastic pollution in their own country. And then we have a few more others, the selective exporters, the exporting polluter, and then also the small-scale inward polluters. Those ones are typically not managing their waste so well, but at least they're not exporting it further. They have to deal with the pollution from their own waste creation. And so the reason why we created those archetypes is because the solutions to plastic pollution is different for each of those archetypes. You don't have the same solutions when you're a waste sponge than when you are a toxic exporter. Of course, the system in which it all evolves is interlinked, but there are some typical actions that countries can do that would work basically in one place and would not work in another one. So we try to give those high-level, very easy to comprehend types of recommendations that countries can just start integrating within their strategy, basically.
So if I understand it correctly, Germany prides itself for a reason, right? We're in the transactor category. Our consumption levels are high, but our waste management effectiveness is very good. We import plastic waste, but we also export it. So we are on both ends. So would you say that Germany is fine as is, or do we also have some tasks ahead of us?
There are definitely a lot of things to still do. And Germany will have its Overshoot Day on the 1st of December. So there's still a full month of plastic overload. It actually results in 16 hours of plastic overshoot, which is not negligible at all. And Germany actually exports more waste than it imports. But one of the issues really with those countries that are on paper not so bad in terms of waste management, but actually are large consumers, is that they still overload other countries' waste management. And, we know, as Julien was saying, there's this huge lack of alignment between the capacity to deal with plastic waste globally and the amounts that we put on the market. Countries like Germany, like most of the global north countries, have a responsibility also in being examples at really implementing circular economy. And when I mean circular economy, it's not just, let's recycle our way out of plastic pollution and implement more collection and recycling. Circular economy is also and foremost based on reducing the volumes of single-use plastics, of short-life plastic, which is really the focus of our report. We focus on the short-life plastics, and replacing it with reusability models, with repair, etc. In general, those models will be a huge part of getting out of the plastic crisis. And global north countries do have the mean to implement such policies. It requires also its own large infrastructure development, a different type than waste management, but it's still infrastructure development with collection, with systems that work, with, in some cases, deposit return schemes and so on. Currently, deposit return schemes in some European countries work, but it's still for recycling. And those same could actually be implemented for reusability. So there is definitely a lot that countries can do for managing their own waste, for reducing their own waste. And then also, of course, in supporting the countries that are currently struggling with the development of their infrastructure. It's, of course, part of a pretty complex dynamic between global south and global north. But there are still a lot of countries that absorb the waste from global north countries, and those are basically filling up the infrastructure that could otherwise deal with the local waste. So there's quite a lot that even the countries that look good on paper could do to actually really be part of the solution.
So that brings us to the strugglers, which include countries like Cuba, like Liechtenstein, Albania, but also many islands, Tuvalu, but also Venezuela. These are the countries that basically need global support through the Plastics Treaty, right?
Yeah. And, you mentioned Tuvalu during the INC2 negotiations in Paris about a month ago. There was one side event around basically the development of infrastructure, etc. And there was this person from the Tuvalu delegation that was there, and that showed images of her islands, of basically the dump sites on the beach, etc., that are creating huge issues for communities, for the environment, etc. And while she was speaking, I was checking in our Plastic Overshoot Day the statistics for this country, and this is very representative of those strugglers. So they have a very early overshoot day, the 28th of January. So it means that they have more than 90% of their waste that is mismanaged. But when you look at their contribution globally to those 157 days of plastic overshoot, they only contribute 2 minutes. And yet they are really the ones that are very impacted by that. And so, it's easy to look and to say, they have such a bad waste management system, they should develop it, etc. When you look at a country that has a very well-developed waste management system, like Germany, for example, Germany contributes to more than 16 hours, and yet it does not take any of the negative consequence of plastic pollution, or way less than a small island like Tuvalu. And so, yes, those countries that are strugglers are typically some medium consumers of plastic, they don't export a lot of their waste, but they face huge issues with managing it. And that's where there should be some collaboration with global north countries that also have the infrastructure and the experience with managing waste. And there's like really a knowledge transfer that has to happen, as well as a funding transfer, because those countries that are strugglers are very also often struggling with adapting to climate change, etc. So unless there is a real support from the global north countries, the small islands and global south countries will continue to struggle as a result of a global economy and global system that they had no responsibility in developing at all, actually.
Mm-hmm. What I find interesting is that fingers are often pointed to Asia, right? But when I look at your country archetype, China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan are actually among the self-sustainers. So they have medium to high consumption levels, but they have average to good waste management. They don't import anymore, we have to say, with China, and they export very little plastics. So let's look at China. What would China's tasks be?
You will remember a few years back, China was finger-pointed as the bad students of the world for being the number one contributor to plastic pollution. And shortly after, it completely closed the imports of waste from Western countries. That was quite a shake in the Western world when China decided that. But then China had an opportunity to really implement more of its local collection so that it continues to fill up its recycling and waste management plans. And that's also why China has improved quite a bit in the past few years, its situation. So this comes as a surprise for some, but it's part of actually quite a thoughtful strategy, let's say, in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. It's so interesting to look at your country archetypes and look at the list of countries that are included, because you wouldn't expect some of them to be listed in the category that they are. Obviously, we've got like the countries who have to do the most work are, I guess, the overloaders, which include the United States, as you mentioned, but also, unfortunately, a European country here, Spain, and even Iceland and Israel, as well as South Korea and Barbados are on this list. And then we've got the toxic exporters, which are they just don't really have good waste management. They consume very much, and they also import a lot of waste. And I guess those also have a lot of work to do, including Uruguay, the United Arab Emirates, Thailand, Saudi Arabia, and many more. But we also have some shining examples, right? The waste saviors. What kind of country type is that? And who are our waste saviors?
Yeah, so the waste saviors are countries which are basically helping other countries deal with their waste. So they have a medium consumption level, a pretty good waste management system in place, and then they import a lot of waste. So they help basically treat the waste that others are creating. And they account for a very small portion of the 157 days. So only a third of a day. So just a few hours of plastic overshoots all together, all of those countries. So it includes Costa Rica, Hungary, New Zealand, Sweden. There are not enough of those, basically, right? They're unfortunately much more overloaders or toxic exporters. But this is also where we would love it if countries were, studying a bit more those country archetypes and setting some goals for them to change archetype, to become either a self-sustainer or in the future even a waste savior. So it's almost like they could be a bit of an improvement curve for countries. And I find it fascinating to actually go country by country. And as you were saying, there are some countries that you're surprised to see them in one place versus another one. And in some cases, it also push yourself to ask, like, okay, why is that? And ourselves, although we work with those data on a daily basis, we go back to it and say, oh yeah, that's because this country, although they have a really good collection system in place, they still have so many unsanitary landfills. So yeah, unsanitary landfills are actually a mismanaged way for the waste. And so that's why they create so much risk for this waste to leak into the environment. And I feel like this is a way of asking yourselves more questions. And that's what we want to trigger with the plastic overshoot.
And you're definitely triggering that for me.
Maybe to add something on this, because I guess we are now some sort of proposing a picture of the current situation with these archetypes. But if we try to look a bit into the future, coming back to the example of Germany or Switzerland or one of these countries, we could say that if all the countries were with a similar waste management situation, we would be in a much better situation. I mean, this is one way to look at the problem. But if we remember that at the end of the day, what we are trying to solve is this mismatch between input and output, we can also say that by just trying to solve the issue by increasing the capacity, we may end up in some sort of rat race where we are going to build infrastructure and more collection and more infrastructure, which basically means more recycling, because at the end of the day, we don't want more incineration, we don't want more sanitary landfills, right? So the question is also whether we can create so much recycling capacity, which I don't think we can. So we, even for these countries like Germany, Switzerland, we need to reduce the consumption. And I guess there is, at least in my mind, some sort of mindset shift that is happening, because we are coming from a waste management perspective, most of us. But I think the plastic problem is is becoming more and more a double-sided problem. On one side, we have this waste management issue to be solved. On the other side, we have the toxicity and chemical aspect of the problem, where we are basically in contact with a lot of chemicals, because plastic is not one material, it's more than 10,000 chemicals that are mixed together, right? And more we see that we have a problem with this health or ecosystem impacts resulting from this chemistry. And that recycling, at the end of the day, if we speak about mechanical recycling, is going to create mixtures of chemicals that are going to be even maybe worse than the original virgin product. So I think we must have that in mind. I guess in the past we had the recycler people with a mindset of circularity saying we can solve the problem with just more circularity. And we had, let's say, the no plastic people saying we just don't need to use no plastic for many reasons. I guess these two extreme mindsets are going to join together more and more, because more and more science is there to show that it's not only about waste management, it's also about toxicity. And this means basically that we just need to reduce the amount of plastic in the system. Of course, we need to build better recycling and better infrastructure, but this will be possible only if we have a decent amount of plastic to deal with, I guess.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much to both of you, Sarah and Julien. It was a pleasure speaking with you. I think many people might now wonder where they can find your report. You have a website, right?
Yes, absolutely. It's plasticovershoot.earth. And there's a short version of the report with just a few examples of countries, and a long version of the report with the 207 or more than 200 countries that they can scroll into. So we definitely encourage people to look up for their country, make more research about it, be curious about it, because this is where the conversation starts. We also have a really important 2 years coming with the treaty negotiations. And we know that negotiators and governments are very conscious about the public opinion, what citizens think. And so the more we can have this conversation in those 2 coming years, the more we can ask for an ambitious treaty that integrates all of the issues surrounding plastic pollution, not just the environmental ones, but also the social ones, etc. The more we are having those conversations, the more chances we have at also ending up with a treaty that is at the level of our expectations. So that's why the Plastic Overshoot reports exist. This is to trigger those conversations.
Great. Thank you so much. And I'll be watching the Plastic Overshoot Day from now on, hoping that we will be able to push it further into the year and that it doesn't move towards the beginning of the year even more. Thank you so much, Sarah and Julien.
Thank you so much for having us.
This was a Plastisphere Conversation with Sarah Perreard, Julien Boucher, and me, Anja Krieger. Theme music is by Dorian Roy and cover art by Maren von Stockhausen. Plastisphere is a passion project which I pursue in my free time and without funding. So if you like the show, please support it. You can tell your friends, write a review, or support the production costs via PayPal. All the links are in the show notes. As this is a new format, I'm super curious to hear back from you. How did you like it? And if you have any questions or ideas what to cover, do write me to anja@plastisphere.earth. See you soon.